Good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Koch, and I'm from the Texas Education Agency. I'm the manager of the Education Service Center and Stakeholder Engagement team. And I want to thank you so much for inviting me today to come and speak to you about non-educational community-based support services grant. And that's a mouthful. So we lovingly like to refer to this as non-ed funds. So you'll hear me use that terminology throughout the presentation. And my goal this afternoon is to provide an overview of non-ed funds and to hopefully answer some of the questions that you have about this support services grant. So during our time this afternoon, here are the objectives of the presentation. Participants will become familiar with Texas Education Code Section 29, subsection 29.013. Participants will learn how funds flow from the legislature all the way down to the service providers. Participants will become familiar with eligibility for funds and what are allowable and unallowable expenditures under this grant. And participants will learn how parents may request access to funds. So a little history about non-educational community-based support services. The 74th legislature appropriated funds to provide non-educational community-based support services effective May 30th back in 1995. These funds have been reauthorized in each subsequent legislative session. Non-educational community-based support services statutory language is found in Texas Education Code Chapter 29, Section 29.013. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a deeper dive into the statutory language to further understand the provisions. So looking at this first section, subsection A, it reads, the agency shall establish procedures and criteria for the allocation of funds appropriated under this section to school districts for the provision of non-educational community-based support services to certain students with disabilities and their families so that those students may receive an appropriate free public education in the least restrictive environment. Again, that's a mouthful. We're going to break that down and talk about exactly what that means. Let's talk about the flow of money. Everybody wants to know, hey, how do you get the money? Who does the money go to? How do we access the money? All of these questions about money. So the Texas Education Agency in statute was charged with establishing procedures for disseminating the non-ed funds. And the established procedures are as follows. First, the money is allocated by the Texas legislature. After it's allocated by the Texas legislature, it is received by the Texas Education Agency. And after TEA receives the money, the Education Service Centers, or the ESC, there's 20 of them across the state, they request funds from the Texas Education Agency. And they request those funds based upon projected needs from their local education agencies in their areas. And then what happens is the money goes from the education service centers to the local education agencies, and the local education agencies provide the money to service providers. And you'll notice here that the last person to receive the money are the service providers, not parents. And that's in statute. And we'll revisit that in a little bit, that the money must be provided directly from the LEAs to service providers and not to parents. So we'll discuss each of these processes more fully throughout the presentation. How do you access the funds? Great question. The parent or the guardian is the key. The parent or the guardian requests to meet with the LEA, the local education agency, or your school district, if you're more familiar with that terminology, to discuss the needs for non-educational services. So the parents initiate the process by requesting to meet with the LEA. And this request may be made at the student's school. The LEA's responsibilities and roles are just as they're listed. First of all, the local education agencies or the school district determines if it wants to apply for non-ed funds from the education service centers. This is an option, and that's also in statute that the LEA may decide if they want to apply or if they're not going to apply. So that's the first step. Secondly, the LEA will conduct meetings at the campus level, and that's where services are recommended. And then the LEA will contact and submit applications to the ESCs for approval. And then the other role that the LEA has is disperses approved funds to the service provider. So all of these roles are attached to the LEA. Finally, we have the ESCs. The ESCs also play a critical role in this process. Annually, the 20 ESCs across the state apply to TEA for funding based on the projected amount needed in each respective region. LEAs who wish to apply for funding contact the ESC in their region. LEAs submit applications received at the local level to the appropriate ESC. ESCs approve the applications and release the funds to the LEAs. Once monies are received at the local level, the LEA pays service providers directly. So as you can see from this slide, ESCs are responsible for approving applications. They're responsible for releasing the funds to the LEAs. And each ESC creates its own process for the non-ed funds and the application. There is no one state application at the TEA level. So to learn more about how your region's non-ed funds process, to learn more about that process, it's best really to contact your local ESC. Each ESC has an assigned person to oversee non-ed funds. Now, if you don't know who that person is, a good place to start would be to contact your local ESC and ask for the special education director. And the special education director will be able to help you in identifying the person that is overseeing non-ed funds. So let's talk about the school-based planning meeting because we mentioned it briefly a little bit earlier. Parents and guardians are the key to accessing non-ed funds. Parents wishing to access services should contact their child's school and request a meeting to discuss the need for non-educational services. LEAs that choose to apply for non-educational funds must have a planning meeting to discuss options for educational services. And the key word in that sentence is must. They must have a planning meeting to discuss options for non-educational services. Who should attend? Well, persons attending and participating in this meeting should include district staff who are knowledgeable about the student. Of course, the student's parents and guardians, and representatives from the local mental health agency or the local community resource coordination group of Texas or other service providers. So people who have knowledge about the student. Who should not attend? The Student's Admission Review and Dismissal Committee, or the ARD, if you're familiar with that terminology, may not serve as this planning group and should not make the decision regarding services. Once the school-based planning committee once it has been determined what services are needed, the LEA contacts the ESC to obtain directions and procedures for applying. Because remember I said we have 20 ESCs and each ESC creates their own process, their own application and their own process for accessing these funds. The LEA makes the final decision about what services are needed because the LEA is ultimately responsible for providing the services or assuring that they are provided and for managing the funds. So the LEAs have a lot of responsibility in this process. Let me read that again. The LEA makes the final decision about what services are needed because the LEA is ultimately responsible for providing services or assuring that they are provided and for managing funds. While the LEA has the primary responsibility of determining what non-ed support services are going to be provided, the role of the CRCG is to assist planning by reviewing and signing off on the non-ed funds application that is submitted by the LEA. The LEA superintendent or designee also signs the application for the LEA. Please note, TEA does not review the applications from the LEAs to the ESCs. Next, we can go back to the statutory language and we can look at subsection B, which addresses eligibility for non-ed funds. So who is eligible for these non-ed funds? Well, number one, students who are not enrolled in public schools are not eligible to receive non-ed funds. Also, students with the Section 504 plan do not qualify for non-educational community-based support services. A student with a disability is a student eligible for special education. So with that in mind, we can read this section that says the funds may be used only for eligible students with disabilities who would remain or who would have to be placed in residential facilities primarily for educational reasons without provision of non-educational community-based support services. So that goes into what is the purpose of the non-ed funds. These funds are used for non-educational support services and allow a student currently in a residential placement due to educational purposes to return home or prevent a student at risk for residential placement due to educational purposes from being placed residentially. The intent of state legislation is for LEAs to provide services that are not allowable purchases through education funds to help families of this population care for the student and to enable families to better cope with having an individual with a disability at home. Moving on to subsection C of the statutory language, it reads as follows. The support services may include in-home family support, respite care, and case management for families with a student who otherwise would have been placed by a district in a private residential facility. We're going to go into more detail about what some of these may look like as well. So here, we're going to have a list of allowable expenditures of non-ed funds. At the end of the presentation, I'm also going to give you a link to something that's on TEA's website where all of these are listed as well. So you don't have to try to remember them or write them down. You're going to have access to them in writing at the end of the presentation. So what are some of the allowable expenditures of non-ed funds? Attendant care. Attendant care is providing occasional outside assistance to parents and families. These services should be provided to normalize routine family activities, including hours when families must sleep. Attendant care is not allowable for babysitting or to replace day or night care services. Another allowable expenditure, psychiatric and psychological consultation. Consulting with the student or the family and all persons involved in providing non-educational services or in causing them to be provided. The focus of consultation should be to develop a functional family unit. This service excludes medical or treatment-related services. Next, we have management of leisure time. This would be working with the student to develop skills that enable the student to entertain him or herself appropriately without adult supervision. This service is closely related to socialization training. Next, we have parent support group. A parent support group would be when service providers are working with a group of parents to develop coping and behavior management skills. Then we move on to peer support group. A peer support group would be service providers working with a group of students to develop appropriate interaction skills. And then last on this slide, we have socialization training. Socialization training would be working with the family to help the student develop appropriate skills and behavior in public. This training is closely related to leisure and time management. Continuing on the next slide, we have a few more allowable expenditures. Individual support. This would be when service providers are preparing the student to be healthy and productive by developing, say, for example, self-esteem. Family support, working with the family to develop a functional family unit. Family dynamics training, providing training for the family to determine family values, family goals, and expectations. And this is more intensive than family support. The one most people are the most familiar with is respite care. And respite care is providing relief to parents and or families with intermittent short-term care. For examples, on the weekends or during school holidays. Regularly scheduled periods of respite care over an extended period of time is not allowable, however. This service should be periodic and short-term. And then lastly, we have generalization training. Training the student and the family to use a behavior management plan outside the structured educational environment. This training may include modeling parenting skills, for example. Now we can move on to what are some unallowable expenditures of non-ed funds. These are a little more straightforward. The first one, food, not allowable. Next, direct payments to parents. Remember, I mentioned earlier that the LEAs must provide the monies for the services directly to the service providers. No direct payments to parents are allowed. Equipment, not allowable. Sheltered workshop services. Babysitting. Transportation to any educational service or any service being provided by another public agency is also not allowable. Medicine, medical prescriptions, doctor and dentist visits, medication, therapy, and evaluations are not allowable. And remodeling and construction of the student's classroom and home are not allowable. Additionally, all special education and related services allowable by IDEA in the implementation of a student's individualized education program, or IEP, including adaptive equipment, art therapy, corrective therapy, music therapy, orientation and mobility training, school health services, recreation therapy, etc. All of these are unallowable because they would be covered under the student's IEP. Students with autism, it should be noted here that the only services that can be paid for with non-educational community-based support service funds for students with autism are respite care or attendant care. In-home training or viable alternatives and parent training that support the student's IEP must be paid for with educational funds according to 19 Texas Administrative Code, subsection 89.1055E. In other words, those are going to be captured under the autism supplement as part of the student's IEP. So they do get these things, but they're paid for with a different funding source, not through non-ed funds, with the exception of respite care and attendant care. The last subsection of the statutory language is subsection D, and it reads as follows. Students who are at risk for non-educational reasons cannot be served with these funds. Students who are currently in a residential facility for primarily non-educational reasons are not eligible for these funds. And then, as I referenced earlier, there's a more detailed explanation of the various allowable expenses at this link. And I do believe you guys have access to this PowerPoint. This will bring you to a webpage, TEA webpage, and this is just frequently asked questions. It's a 4-page document, and TEA put this together because these were the questions that we were receiving most often. So they're all captured here for your reference. I covered a lot of these in my presentation. And then last, more detailed explanation of the various allowable supports. Here's another link to a TEA webpage, non-educational community-based support services. It gives a little bit about the history that we talked about. The current support services are listed here. And then we have a chart, allowable and unallowable expenditures. These are the ones that we went over. So they're all here for you to access. And then the application process, just as we also reviewed, that it starts at the local education agency. And just to remind you, my name is Stephanie Koch, and here is my email address. If you have questions, I would prefer that you would just email them to me, and then I would get back to you. Any questions that you may have for me. Let me check the chat real quick. I don't know that I can drop that link in the chat. Let me see. I can try. No, it's not letting me. I'm sorry. I'm not the most techie person, but you should have access to the whole PowerPoint, and it'll be at the end of the PowerPoint. So that is the end of my session.
Stephanie, are you able to hear us from this side?
I can hear you.
Awesome. So we have a room full of people who, and I just wanted to open it up. My name is Natalie, and I'm on the here on in the physical world up in Austin. And did anyone in here have a question for Stephanie? Okay, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to be passing around a microphone with some questions.
My question is, are there any timelines associated with the LEA's response to a parent's request for non-ed fund consideration, similar to a request for an FIE?
Yeah, no, it's not in statute. So they may have some local policies at the local level, what parameters they put around that, but it is not in statute, no.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So you said they may have a policy, so that means it's not a required policy of a timeline? Is that something that might be in their student code of conduct or their student handbook?
It possibly could. I mean, that may be a place where they have that, like their process of requesting those meetings and their process of what that meeting looks like. They may have some best practices that they've come up with or processes that they've created at the local level.
The intent of my question is that my family benefits from non-ed funding every year for several consecutive years now. And we usually begin the process of requesting the non-ed funding from our school district on the first day of school. And often our application is not approved until into the summertime. And I know that those funds expire, so we usually have a very limited amount of time to access them. So I was just wondering if there was any way to expedite that process at our school district, because, you know, we're usually awarded a sizable amount and have a very limited amount of time to use them.
Sure. All of these, it's a great question. All of this really are local decisions. They're not up at the TEA level. They're not even at the ESC level. These are at your LEA level. So whoever is in your meeting at your LEA, and if the correct people are not there, you may want to include people, some district folks, some special education director, those kinds of folks. And then I don't know if you have other community people that are also with you that can also voice the same concerns that you have, and just telling your story to see how together everyone can collaborate and come up with some solutions for you.
My LEA has never had that meeting.
How do you access the funds?
Lots and lots of emails.
Okay. Well, if you want to email directly, I'm happy to have a conversation with you and see what kinds of things we can come up with.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Sure.
Just a quick thought. I'm wondering, from your perspective at TEA, do you feel like the DSHAC or the District Student Health Advisory Committee is an appropriate place maybe to have that, to bring that up, or?
I'm also a member of my district special education advisory committee, and I have brought it to the attention of our executive director of special education.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for answering the question. Did anyone else have a question? There's a question in the chat, but I'm going to hand it to Julie to help us out.
Hi, Stephanie. This question's coming from a virtual attendee.
Okay.
The question is kind of a comment and then a question. I would love to hear any success stories or examples of situations in which this funding was utilized. And in this individual's local area, they have not seen an example of an ISD utilizing this, and would like to hear about roadblocks and assistance in bridging the gaps.
Okay. Well, again, we are so far removed at TEA because these are things that are happening at the local level. One possibility would be to reach out to your ESC if you know what region you're in, and discuss with the person at the ESC who oversees non-ed funds to share some of those success stories with you. And that may be a place to get some of those answers.
Thanks, Julie. Any other questions in here? Okay.
Hi, I'm not sure if you had mentioned this, but I just wanted some clarification. Can non-ed funds be utilized for camps for kids using respite?
That's a great question. And again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but that's a local decision. You need to have that parent meeting, and they would have, because there's a lot of information that would need to be discussed about that and a lot of the parameters around that. So it's not a yes or no. That's why the parent meetings are mandatory by statute, to have those, to discuss what would the benefits be, and then to make a decision and then a recommendation.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Anyone else in here have any more questions? Okay. Anything else, Julie, in the chat box? Okay, well, thank you very much, Stephanie, for your time and for sharing. And as she mentioned, this slide deck will be available for all of you to take a look at. And I encourage you to reach out to Stephanie. As a former employee at the Texas Education Agency, it's myself. They're very responsive and helpful and can connect you where you need to get more information.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.